All right, thanks very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm just going to project since I lecture for a living. So this has absolutely nothing to do with my research. I wrote this talk a couple of years ago to wind up all of my environmentally minded colleagues who think that solar panels and electric cars grow on trees. So I'm basically going to give you, I'm probably preaching to the converted here really, but I'm going to give you an overview of what are mineral resources and some of the challenges that actually lie ahead for us as a community to actually deliver what society is asking us to do, even if society doesn't realise that's what they're asking for. And there's a whole bunch of challenges around this. There are technical challenges, and the bigger challenges is probably a societal challenge around the perception that mining has in our broader community, and the challenge and some of these other issues that we have, both on a local scale as well as on a global scale. So mineral resources are sorts of things that we're all very familiar with: gold, silver, iron ore, etc. Some of the clean tech metals that are becoming increasingly talked about, things like gallium and indium, things used in solar panels. Rare earth elements have obviously got a lot of press. You know you've really made it as an element when you get it included on a Netflix drama series, which happened, of course, in House of Cards. And then agricultural minerals, which I don't think we talk about all that much as a community, but particularly in New Zealand in the last couple of months, this has got a lot of traction and a lot of angst from the public about how evil New Zealand fertiliser companies are. So why do we need resources? This is a fairly well-known diagram that I stole off Larry Meinert, former mineral deposit director for the USGS. This is Shanghai in the late 1980s, and if anyone wonders where all the iron ore from the Pilbara has gone, I'm pretty sure this is where it's ended up. That is what Shanghai looks like basically in the modern day. Of course, an enormous flux of material into China to modernise that country. And Larry's favourite stat that he told me at the Gordon Research Conference a couple of months ago is that China, in the last 3 years, has used more concrete than America poured in the last 100 years. It's absolutely phenomenal, the amount of resource material resource that's been put into China, and I don't think that's really discussed or talked about enough. So visualising resources, I don't think we also have a really strong grasp of this, and particularly the public don't. They do think that materials grow on trees, and so there's this interesting South African artist who's put together a series of these slides for copper and gold and really depressingly, if you want to look at it, diamonds. And he basically shows you in a CGI format the amount of material that comes out of a mine. So here we've got a virtual ball of copper that's come out of that mine, and I think it's a really strong visual representation of, we take a large body of rock and we actually produce a relatively small amount of material out of the end of it, but of course we need that material. So up to around about the turn of the 20th century, as a society, we only used about 12 elements on the periodic table for making the bulk of our materials: iron and copper, zinc, etc. But over the last century or century and a bit, we've massively expanded the types of materials that we use. And this is this diagram is shown as sort of better living through chemistry. In reality, of course, this is better living through mining. It's mining that delivers almost all of these raw materials, except for basically carbon, which does grow on trees. So mining is, of course, part of a process, and it's not a process that I think we talk about enough. Mining is sort of portrayed as the bad guy, and then the consumers sit up here, and consumers don't understand really any of these linkages that occur between the resource sector and what actually ends up with literally in our pockets. So mining is, of course, a process where we find materials, we extract those materials are concentrated, refined, turned into consumer products, and all of those processes actually have footprints that are associated with them, whether it's a choice to recycle, a choice to produce new products. So what are the issues that we could talk about and that I've been talking about to various groups, which are what resources do we need, especially as technology changes? Do we have enough of them? People, if you read websites, are always harking on about the fact that there's not enough lithium to make electric cars, so why bother when we can just keep on with internal combustion engines? And our true big challenges, I think, are at the bottom here, are two major issues, which are how do we actually get and extract the resources that we need while minimising the environmental impact of doing so. That's getting more challenging as we move to lower grade resources. And particularly, we have issues around the public perception and understanding of the general resource sector, and particularly mining. Okay, so favourite graphic, the Minerals Education Coalition, which is basically a collection of mining companies in America, produce a series of cute diagrams like this that basically show you what every American baby will need. Now, an Australian baby will be different to an American baby, as will a New Zealand baby, but fundamentally the point is, in the first world, we consume an awful amount of resources. Now, I don't think that's just the relatively poor American diet that's consuming so much salt. That's, of course, the salt they're putting on their roads, which is not really an issue in Australia or New Zealand in terms of weather. But we consume a tremendous amount of mineral resource living a first world lifestyle. It's amazing. If you add up this volume of material, it literally runs into the hundreds of tons of earth materials needed for the average first world citizen. The USGS, these aren't just made up numbers by the minerals industry trying to look good or important. The USGS actually pulls this data together. They're the only organisation that I'm aware of that really does this at a government level. And every country will be different. But if you look at the per capita consumption of minerals, coal, New Zealanders in the audience can feel really good about this. Australians not quite so much. But we consume a tremendous amount of mineral resource. Uranium, we don't really consume any of it, but we're fairly happy to ship it around the world. But in New Zealand, on a per person basis, we'd actually use about twice as much phosphorus as Americans do. And that, of course, reflects an agriculturally intensive economy. So really a tremendous amount of mineral resource demand on an annual basis for all of us. So what drives resource consumption? Well, of course, it's to do with economic wealth, and it's to do with making things. And this is Jeff Jang, who I think used to work for Anglo as a mineral economics analyst, put this data together, which he sent to me, and I turned it into a slightly less offensive movie with less Game of Thrones music. But if you want to look at Jeff's original presentation where he gives a really nice commentary about this, then please go and look at it. But this is going to show, this is a graph of GDP, so basically per person, so national wealth. And on the y-axis is copper consumption per person. And what we see in general terms is that there's a pretty good linear relationship between the amount of mineral resource you consume and the gross domestic product per person. So if you're wealthy, you consume more minerals. So let's look at how this has changed since 1980, when this data set begins, and how it is going to change through the next 35 years or so. So hopefully this is going to play. So the bubbles are basically proportional to the size of the population in those countries. And what we're going to see here is the rise of China as a consumer of copper, and of course a massive rise in the GDP per person as China has modernised. You're also going to watch right now the collapse of the UK manufacturing industry, and as it falls off the bottom there, the UK basically consumes almost no copper because they have no manufacturing industry. And you could also see the US starting to decline there as well. So essentially our resource consumption is driven by our demand for materials and essentially wealth factors or productivity factors. So the more you manufacture, the higher you'll be per person. The more you consume, probably the wealthier you are as a nation. And if you're interested, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand is that little red dot there, which you would have also noticed started to drop down in the last few years with the loss of manufacturing. So almost all of our mineral resources are in increasing demand globally. I've pulled together a few random graphs that I found on doing research on Google on a boring academic evening. So increasing demand for things like stainless steel, which is a pretty good predictor of sort of wealth. Countries use stainless steel for things like hospital theatres and kitchens and of course in your pots and pans at home. So we see more and more stainless steel being used, which is of course iron and nickel and the other elements that are contained within stainless steel. We, of course, have the rise of new technology such as the smartphone. So if you've got children that don't like mining, this is an excellent graphic to hand to them and then take their phone off them at the same time. Okay, and a smartphone, a flip phone from 20 years ago used, again, about 10 elements, lead, copper. A smartphone uses, sort of half the periodic table. They really are a major change, and they're very relatable because literally everyone has a smartphone in their pocket these days. So we are all interacting with with minerals. So critical materials has got a lot of press in the last few years. Everyone's sort of jumped on board the bandwagon for different reasons. Economic geology, academics because it makes us feel relevant again. Mining companies because it makes them feel good about what they do and about to sell it to the public. So there's a number of materials that, and of course this was really driven by China restricting the supply of rare earth elements. There's a number of materials that countries have deemed critical for some sort of strategic reason, like wanting to make missile warheads, or perhaps New Zealand, we'll probably have phosphorus so we can put it onto our paddocks. So there are a number of materials that different groups, and this is a UK report, have defined as being critically important for various sectors. So these materials are all considered critical, but if you actually look at the reserves, this isn't resources, this is economically defined reserves. We have ample reserves of almost all the metals that are considered critical. Now, this doesn't mean that they're all evenly distributed, and this doesn't mean that they're ready to start mining. There could well be a number of years between finding something, there will be a number of years between finding something and actually digging it out of the ground. The things like rare earth elements, there's a huge amount of angst about. They're not particularly rare. They're all over the place. The challenge for them is producing them while minimising environmental impact, which is why the Western world has been quite happy to let China do literally the dirty work on our behalf. Very damaging and difficult to extract and purify from one another. So we don't really have a shortage of anything. But if you look at, for example, the growth of some of these commodities, the green line there is gallium, seen an absolutely incredible increase in demand, thousands of percent increase in the last 25 to 30 years. Gallium is, of course, a major component of solar panels, but if you look at gallium, we have reserves somewhere greater than 1 million tonnes, and we use globally about 280 tonnes per year. So while gallium is a massive demand increase from solar panel production, we're actually got absolutely no shortage of gallium whatsoever. So we will certainly be able to have a solar panel on our roof. So do we actually have enough minerals? And this is something that the media picks up on periodically because someone will say that we're going to run out of something, or someone starts to get angsty about electric cars. So this has been talked about a number of times by different people. The pretty famous Limits to Growth document put out by the Group of Rome predicted that we were going to run out of copper by 1993 and aluminium in 2003, which to the delight of all beer drinkers has not come to fruition. And more recently, some authors in a geochemical journal document from in the EU said that we would have peak mineral production by about 2050. Well, of course, what those authors are really forgetting is that we have differences between reserves and resources. And we essentially could probably say we have almost infinite resources that we can lean on, but as we lean on lower and lower grade mineral deposits, we have increasing environmental impact and energy cost of producing them. So we don't really have infinite mineral resources, but we certainly have a lot more than these types of documents have said that we do. So mineral demand. We consume a vast array of mineral resources. They're becoming more diverse, and we are certainly increasing our resource demand, not necessarily on a per person basis, but as the human population grows globally and as it modernises, we are consuming an awful amount of more mineral resource. We are starting to use new and different mineral resources. So let's take a little bit of a look at how that mineral demand is changing over time. So lithium, so people talk about lithium a lot. There's obviously a lot of press around lithium. Western Australia is certainly putting a lot of effort into this in terms of what was it, the Silicon Valley of batteries, I think it was being promoted, I saw on LinkedIn. And indeed, lithium demand globally has climbed a lot over the last 25 years or so, as of course it goes into our various electronic devices, and now it's of course going into electric car batteries. So demand is increasing. As is the price of lithium. The price of lithium really spiked earlier this year. It's now back down a bit off these highs from when I snipped this graphic in early 2018. But the lithium price has certainly risen, driven by demand. Now, this demand is of course all driven by electric cars and the goal to decarbonise our economies, and electric cars are certainly going to be part of solving that particular problem. The International Energy Agency predicts that by 2030 we'll have approximately 125 million electric cars, so I hope Elon Musk is getting busy in California. And that is going to lead to an inevitable, pretty significant demand for batteries. So if you add, this is a prediction from Bloomberg, and they predict that by 2030, if you add all those numbers up, you come up with something like 6,000 gigawatt hours. And if you think about the gigawatt factory that Elon Musk has produced, it's going to have to produce a number of similar sized facilities to allow the scale up to occur. So an enormous demand in batteries is predicted. Can we actually deliver what they are asking for in terms of resources? So I did a little bit of back of the envelope math. You can sort of find data on how much lithium and how much cobalt is in a kilowatt hour of lithium battery capacity. Some of that's fairly proprietary, so these were some guesstimates that I found on the internet. I don't know that anyone's actually taken a Tesla battery and done an assay, but if anyone would like to, that would be useful. If you do this, you get estimates of something, and you take those sort of the amount of gigawatt hours of batteries we're going to build. We need something like 1 to 2.5 million tonnes of cobalt will be required by 2030. We currently produce about 100,000 tonnes a year, so some very simple math. We're certainly going to have to scale that cobalt production up considerably, which has some particular challenges associated with it, considering the part of the world that the bulk of our cobalt comes from. We need about 1 million tonnes of lithium. We currently produce about 50,000 tonnes a year. So this certainly predicts that ramp up will need to be rapid, and indeed it is forecast to be quite rapid. So these were some graphs that the UK Geological Survey produced a few years ago now of their estimates of how much lithium might be demanded over the next 35 years or so through to 2050. So maybe we might need about 1 million tonnes a year by 2050 was the estimate, and by 2030 a few 100,000 tonnes a year. Morgan Stanley estimates that we will be producing about 500,000 tonnes a year of lithium by 2025, which if you're a lithium producer would probably mean that the price of lithium is going to go down a little bit if I remember my high school economics properly. So it looks like a pretty typical commodity cycle. Demand, increase in supply, and then we're probably going to crash the price. And of course, we probably can't push the price of lithium too high because A, we have ample reserves of it, but one of the major lithium resources is lithium in the ocean and dissolved in seawater. So we have an absolutely phenomenal lithium resource available. Something like 231 billion tonnes of lithium is available in seawater as dissolved. And the price of recovering that seawater is estimated to be somewhere on the order of $7 to $10 per kilogram. So the price point earlier this year was sitting about $6 per kilogram. So we don't really need much of a lithium price increase before you could basically go to extracting it out of seawater as being economically feasible. So we can certainly supply as much lithium as electric cars and Elon Musk are going to demand. So greening the world. So society is really aiming to move to low carbon technologies as we try to reduce our fossil fuel consumption. And there are various numbers that float around about this, but the World Wind Energy Association forecasts something like a 25-fold increase in wind power generation by 2050 beyond our current installed capacity. So there's going to be a lot of wind turbines that are going to be produced. So let's just give a little bit of background on energy, and let's not talk down the scale of the challenge. So this is world energy consumption since 1971, almost the last 50 years. We can see that energy consumption in the OECD has gone up about 40%. That's this light grey box here. And energy consumption in non-OECD countries, or basically the second and third world, has gone up by over a factor of 2. So we are seeing a significant increase in global energy consumption, consistent with both a growing population and an increasingly modernised population. If we zoom in a little bit, and I picked on Europe here, let's look at the scale of the challenge. So here's the total energy consumption in Europe. put into the equivalent of millions of tonnes of oil. And the top two bars here, the orange one and the purple one, are the low carbon technologies, renewables and nuclear power. So if you look at the total energy mix in Europe, only about 20 to 25% of their total energy consumption is produced from renewable sources. Something like 75% is supplied by fossil fuels as either gas, petroleum or coal. So the challenge here is absolutely phenomenal about the amount of, we have to grow either the nuclear, and the public isn't very fond of nuclear energy, or the renewable, which they are very fond of, by an absolutely enormous amount to cover off this deficiency that's going to be left as we try to draw down on fossil fuel consumption. So a pretty significant challenge awaits us. We have to replace all of this part of the pie with this part of the pie. So this part has to grow a lot. So we, as a resource society, or as a resource industry, are going to have to deliver those materials, and we're probably going to have to deliver them pretty quickly. So again, I did some very simple back-of-the-math envelope based on taking some extrapolations from a paper which I've got the reference to in my talk by Vidal and co-workers. So you can take that estimate of the total number of wind turbines that the World Wind Energy Association thinks are going to be built. You can look at the amount of mineral resources embedded in each wind turbine, and you can come up with how much material is going to be needed, and then I divide that by our current production rate to sort of look at the current global years of production you would need. So stainless steel, wind turbines are pretty heavy on stainless steel. We obviously don't want them corroding out in the environment, particularly offshore. This is a major issue, so you need a lot of stainless steel. So to get the installed wind turbine base that we need by 2050, we need something like the equivalent of, in today's terms, 20 years of stainless steel production to do that. Now, of course, we use stainless steel for a whole lot of other things as well. So the implication is we're going to massively need to grow the amount of materials that go into stainless steel and indeed scale up stainless steel production. If you look at neodymium that's used in the magnets in the wind turbines, this is probably a much bigger problem. We need the equivalent of 20 years of neodymium production, and we've only got 32 years to go. So these are all very back of the envelope calculations, but the implication of all of them is we're going to need an awful lot of mineral resource to deliver what society is asking to be done in terms of decarbonising the economy. So the really unfortunate thing about this is that hydropower, hydrocarbons and nuclear, the public's three least favourite ways of producing energy, all are incredibly minerals efficient. Wind power and PV, which everyone is in love with, actually have a pretty high material demand in terms of the amount of energy that you get back out of them again. So as we put in more wind turbines and more solar panels, there's a lot of embedded materials built into those technologies. And again, we're going to have to supply them. Rare earth element demand, this is probably going to be a major issue unless some alternative technology comes along that means we don't have to use rare earth elements. Producing rare earth elements at the moment requires two major issues. You have a whole lot of pretty nasty solvents to enable the separation of elements from one another. The rare earth elements are really similar, which is why academic geochemists like me love to confuse people with them. They give us information, that's great, but it makes them actually really difficult to separate. And anyone who's ever done any neodymium isotope work will be familiar with putting horrible little drops of acid down tubes for hours and hours. Industry has to scale that up. That's really challenging. The other challenge with rare earth elements is they like to hang out with uranium and thorium, which means you then have radioactive tailings to deal with. So that, if you don't want to co-produce those, is also a problem. So a couple of my favourite quotes from this paper by Vidal and co-workers. The demand for base metals is currently increasing by 5% annually, and if this trend continues, the quantity of metal production for the next 15 years will need to match that from the start of humanity to 2013. Pretty phenomenal. My other favourite quote in here is that European industries consume more than 20% of the metals that are mined globally, yet European mines produce only 1.5% of the iron and aluminium and 6% of the copper. So essentially, European industries consume resources that they take from other countries. So everyone says to me, yeah, but Shaun, what about recycling? We can just recycle our way out of the problem. So recycling's really good. We all love recycling. We can drink our beer bottles and put our aluminium cans in the recycling and feel good about it, and we should do. But if you actually look at the recycling rates for a number of our elements, particularly the new ones that we're using, these rates are very, very poor. So anything in red is recycled at something like a less than 1% rate. And if you go onto any internet forums like I do in New Zealand, as soon as someone talks about electric cars, there's someone jumping up and down about how we don't recycle any lithium batteries and they're going to end up in landfills, and there's this toxic explosive lithium that's going to destroy the world, and we should keep on driving our cars with internal combustion engines. A lot of our elements are actually pretty good at recycling. Most of our base metals are pretty good at recycling. Lead, we're pretty good at recycling. But a number of our other elements we can certainly get better at. The problem with recycling is that it is not going to answer our problems. Another quote from the UN Environmental Report on Recycling in 2013 basically says that as populations and emerging economies adopt similar technologies and lifestyles as currently used in OECD countries, global metal needs will be 3 to 9 times larger than all the metals currently used in the world. So that means that all of our employment futures are looking pretty secure. So we use a lot of resources. Unless we all want to significantly reduce our lifestyles, this resource consumption is essentially unavoidable, and we can't recycle our way out of the problem as much as Apple would like to tell us that they can. Okay, so as second and third world countries modernise, they're going to require new resources, and we ourselves are using new resources as we change our technology. So our challenge, I think, is to educate the public about how does mining become socially acceptable. So mining impacts, well, if you live next to a mine or you go visit a mine or you work in a mine, you'll realise these impacts. There's noise, there's dust, particularly if you're not doing a good job. If you're engineers, geotech guys get it a little bit wrong, like they did at Waihi a couple of years ago, your pit might fall down, which freaks the public out if their house is a little bit up the hill. And you might have some social impacts associated with rapid changes in community sort of dynamics. In the medium term, probably a lot of those problems go away, the mine stops, you start rehabilitation, so maybe you've got water quality concerns, maybe slope stability. And in the long term, what the public is really worried about is water quality issues. And we should be able to mitigate most of those problems if we do a good job of our engineering. So here's Golden Cross, the beautiful Coromandel Peninsula. This is an epithermal low sulfidation mine that started in the early 90s, basically up here. So I've got a few different crappy aerial shots to show you guys. Here's Golden Cross in full production, making a bit of a mess of that nice farmland. Here's the open pit. Here's the tailings dam. Unfortunately, a few years after they commenced production, they discovered they'd put the tailings dam on top of a landslide, so they decided they better stop loading it, and so mining was shut down. And today, this is what it looks like, a nicely revegetated open pit. A bit of a lake up here and the tailings dam that the ducks like to hang out in. And here's the water treatment plant that Coeur d'Alene, the mining company, still mans almost 25 years later, treating the effluent out of the mine, which is probably actually mostly related to the historical mining activity at Golden Cross rather than the modern mining operation. So mining, when it's done well, done in the first world, normally we get a pretty positive, certainly there's some impact, but we get a pretty positive environmental result. Unfortunately, every so often someone does get it wrong, either by unfortunate circumstances or maybe doing something not quite right. This was the major Brazilian dam collapse in 2015, which of course created a huge amount of devastation. So when mining companies get things wrong, when the engineers, it's never geologists, it's important to note that, when engineers get things wrong, it can have some pretty devastating consequences. And so in New Zealand, that helpfully gets us headlines like some of these ones. Environmental watchdogs celebrate Schedule 4. That's a very New Zealand thing, but it basically means that you couldn't mine on conservation land. Their spokesperson says that the economic environmental impacts of mining are becoming clearer and clearer, and it's not worth it. Well, it very clearly is worth it, because we're going to need the mining to deliver the outcomes that we want. But in New Zealand, and indeed in other first world countries, we have all sorts of conversations like this, and the New Zealand government is busy trying to stop as much mining activity as it possibly can. And the inevitable result of that is that we are going to go and mine in other people's countries. So China is very active, as well as other countries, other companies, into deep water mining, which indeed I believe has just started in PNG. And this is my favourite example of cognitive dissonance in the last few years. So a huge media storm around New Zealand taking phosphate from sort of disputed areas in the Western Sahara, purchasing it. Here we have Average Hot Guy on the internet stating that I can't believe the comments, like necessary for our economy, not as bad as other options, show people completely devoid of humanity. And I guess the same people to see no ethical issue in importing fertiliser from Auschwitz. So he's pretty fired up about New Zealand getting phosphorus from the Sahara. Now, a couple of years ago, Chatham Rock Phosphate had proposed extracting phosphate nodules locally offshore in New Zealand, and people were pretty against that as well. Seegan McClay here is urging investors to make ethical decisions about their investment and not to buy any Chatham Rock Phosphate shares. So people don't want to get it from the Sahara and they don't want to get it from New Zealand, so I'm not sure where New Zealand wants to get its phosphorus from. I imagine probably Australia. But massive cognitive dissonance around where does our resources that our economies and we rely on for our lifestyle actually come from. So where do these attitudes actually get developed? So CSIRO has done a couple of really interesting surveys in Australia and in Chile, asking people, do you think mining is significant to the Australian economy? And most people sort of agreed with this. And people sort of agreed that mining is important for Australia's future prosperity, and people were kind of a bit iffy about whether mining is not necessary for Australia. So not exactly a great outcome for a country that is, of course, incredibly dependent on its mining sector for its economy. They went and asked the same questions in Chile, and Chileans said, yeah, mining's really important for Chile, it's really important for Chile's future prosperity, and roughly about the same number of people said mining's not really necessary for Chile. So people very supportive of mining in Chile. But I know you can't read these numbers, but you can look at my slides later if you want to, but when people ask Australians and Chileans about what impacts mining had, Chileans were universally in agreement that mining has negative impacts to a far greater extent than they were in Australia. So Chileans say we really need mining, and mining is causing damage to our country of different kinds. It's causing impacts. And when you ask them overall, is mining worth it, Australians are kind of like, yeah, I guess so, and Chileans are like, hell yes. So Chile is basically full of IMBYs, okay, people who want mining in their society, and we can have a discussion later about why that is. But I would guess it's because they've seen the positive impacts of mining on Chile's economy over the last 60 years or so. So people have seen the gains from mining, whereas in Australia, because you've had mining and such a great lifestyle for so long, people are kind of like, yeah. So of course we have people who have environmental concerns about mining, and they're very real and very valid concerns. There's no doubt that mining damages the environment, and even companies that are doing the best job properly, you are causing environmental damage, and it's essentially an unavoidable reality of resource demand, and we should be talking about that instead of just saying that, well, mining doesn't really cause any damage or trying to sweep it under the carpet. We need to be having this discussion. And we have to get the public to reconcile their demand for resources with the impacts that they have along the way when they actually make consumer decisions. We have to communicate about this. Now, there's certainly technology coming like blockchain that I imagine could have a fairly major impact. As a producer, if you could say, I have produced my metal in this way, it's been ethically produced in New Zealand or Australia underneath the best environmental constraints, please pay more for my copper or gold than you do from the guy from China who's done an absolutely terrible job on their environment. So maybe there's some opportunities here for companies that are behaving very responsibly in the first world. So what's the way forward? Well, we're going to have some rational discussions with the public, and certainly the social media sort of echo chamber is probably not the way forward here, but people are going to have rational discussions about their resource consumption and how do we make choices about where can we mine, how do we plan mining activity, and how do we regulate it to make sure that it's done properly. And how are we going to balance our inherent need for resources with potentially increasing resource scarcity or certainly greater impacts of extracting those resources. As we move to different environments, deeper mines, as we move to potentially offshore mines or lower grade deposits, we are likely to get larger environmental impacts associated with that resource extraction. If you decide you're going to mine copper at 0.25%, you can do it economically, you have to move twice as much rock as a 0.5% deposit or 4 times as much rock as a 1% deposit. So lower grade resources mean moving more rock, which means a larger environmental footprint. So globally, as a society, we should be trying to mine the highest grade resources possible, not wherever the public thinks they should let us mine. And somehow we're going to have to get people to rationalise, hell no, don't put a mine in my backyard. versus the yes please, if you'll go mine in their backyard, that'd be good, thank you very much. We're going to have to get people to recognise where resources actually are, and I think that we're going to have to do public education at a variety of levels, probably starting in schools, about where do your resources come from, not just minerals, but where do your water resources come from, where do your energy resources come from, where do your food resources come from, and where do your mining resources come from, so that people have the education that they need to actually make choices. And we're going to have to get the media to get involved with this and engage with this to help to educate the public. So thanks very much.